everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. This is the first video I'm recording with my new Canon cam. Hopefully everything looks crystal clear. Anyway, gather round bookworms, because it's time for a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 2 of Runnin With The Devil by Van Halen's manager, Noel Monk. A lot of people have been eagerly waiting for this chapter. I hope it was worth the wait. Chapter 2 is called Debut Album. Here we go. I can't believe they're late. That's what I remember thinking as I sat at a table in a restaurant in Burbank with Carl Scott, Ted Cohen, and a member of the Warner Brothers publicity department. The four of us were supposed to meet with the guys from Van Halen at 1 in the afternoon. Now I understood as well as anyone that the majority of musicians have only a tenuous grasp on the concept of time, so punctuality is generally not to be expected. But I hoped that this would be different. A new band, young, eager, and on the cusp of stardom, only having just received its big break. A band whose first album was scheduled to be released on a major label within the next month. A band that soon would be embarking on a major tour to support said album. You would think, or at least hope, that a band in this situation would show up for a meeting with its bosses and new tour manager on time, or maybe even a little early. But you'd be wrong. I looked at my watch, 1:10. Then I looked at it a bunch of times, 1:15, 1:20. Where the are these guys? Finally, around 1:35, they showed up, looking not just disheveled, which is what I had expected, but utterly exhausted. And by exhausted, I don't mean that they looked like they had been up all night, living up to their reputation. No. Instead, they were red-faced, sweaty, and breathing heavily. They looked like they had just competed in some sort of athletic event, and lost. David naturally did most of the talking, as would be the case for the next 7 years, although he was far more subdued in that moment than the man I would come to know. He apologized on behalf of himself and his friends, and explained that no disrespect was intended. "Our car broke down on the way over," he said rather sheepishly, "and we ran the rest of the way." Behind him were the Van Halen brothers and Michael Anthony. They nodded in agreement before taking a seat at the table. I looked at Carl, then at Ted. They both just sort of shrugged. What the? It's rock and roll, right? Actually, no. As the meeting went on, I came to the conclusion that these guys were probably telling the truth. Their car really had broken down, and they really had legged it all the way across town to the meeting. It was one of those things that showed the kind of dedication needed to make an impression in a business like this. Whatever it takes, you do. They didn't carry themselves with even the slightest bit of arrogance or hubris. Instead, they seemed downright shy and humble. Not exactly what I had come to expect in musicians in general, and certainly not from a band that had been so highly touted by Carl Scott. I expected these guys to strut into the restaurant like kings, as if they believed that rock and roll was theirs for the taking. Given what I had heard, and I'm not talking about their music, I still hadn't heard a single Van Halen song. I expected them to be self-assured, if not downright cocky. They weren't. Instead, they were a quartet of long-haired kids in tattered jeans and worn boots, barely out of their teens. If I had seen them on the street, I probably would have assumed they were younger, maybe even in high school. They were shy and reserved, and clearly nervous about meeting the men who were going to be largely responsible for whether their careers soared or sank over the next few months. They knew they were late for an important meeting, and they clearly felt bad about it, which I found rather endearing. They understood the stakes, and they conducted themselves in an appropriate and respectful manner. Truth be told, it was pretty charming. Carl introduced everyone, and I quickly tried to put names and faces to the descriptions I had heard from him beforehand. David was tall, good-looking, with long hair and a mouthful of big teeth. Teeth that needed a good bleaching, by the way. David had ignored dental hygiene for some time, an issue that we had to address fairly early on, but it was an easily correctable flaw. Here was the lead singer and front man that Carl had raved about. He had talked more than the others, but not so much that I could gain any insight into his true nature or into the charisma that he would display on stage. Edward was cherubic, with an ever-present smile and eyes that always seemed half-closed, as if he were stoned. He was friendly, polite, and surprisingly shy, and I liked him right from the start. Was he a great guitar player? Who the knew? I certainly couldn't tell just by looking at him. Alex and Michael were supporting players even in this setting. Alex was skinny with long, kinky hair and protruding teeth. He didn't talk much, and neither did Michael, who was shorter than the others and much stockier, with a strong upper body and muscular arms that he liked to show off. He was friendly, if reserved. None of the boys did a lot of talking at this meeting, but David and Edward handled whatever needed to be said and made it clear that they were the leaders of the band, not just on stage and vinyl, but in matters of business as well. Here's the thing I could tell right away, that they were naive and innocent, or maybe just intimidated. For whatever reason, they asked very few questions during this meeting, nor during the follow-up session after lunch at the Warner Brothers headquarters. I was the person designed to be their tour manager, so one might have expected that they would be curious about the logistics of touring, but they weren't. Mostly they just wanted to ask me about the Sex Pistols and what I thought of Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious. Unlike so many other bands I was used to working with, Van Halen were really still just normal. They were excited and enthusiastic, of course, but also as awestruck and intimidated by the industry as you'd expect a bunch of SoCal kids to be. It was kind of refreshing, so I told them the truth, that Sid and Johnny were just like them. Younger, definitely dirtier, worse table manners, hopefully much more difficult to take out on tour than Van Halen would be. I had high hopes, what can I say? And as is common in the record industry, this innocence had already been exploited long before I entered the picture. By the time we met for lunch, they had already been fed into the music machine and spat out in a tale as old as time. Find a new unproven and unmanaged band desperate for stardom, offer to propel them to the top, and have your high-priced Hollywood entertainment lawyers wave a stiff, extremely skewed contract in their faces. Like many that came before them and would no doubt come after, the boys were unprepared for the ruthlessness of the industry, and so they signed said contract amid assurances that it was industry standard. After all, what if they never got another offer like this, or another offer, period? Their future as a band hung in the balance, so to speak, and it's no wonder that Van Halen had signed a contract that heavily favored Warner Brothers. Similarly, their personal manager had been suggested by Mo Austin, an astute judge of talent and commercial potential, and one slick mother. I have no doubt Mo wanted a manager that would be favorable to his company. That person was Marshall Burla. Marshall had a long history in Hollywood, fueled by deep family ties in show business. Before moving into the personal management game, he'd spent more than a decade as a talent agent at William Morris, where his clients included the Beach Boys, Little Richard, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and Marvin Gaye, among others. I never did find out exactly how he came to know about Van Halen, but I do know that he was at the Starwood on the same night that Mo Austin and Ted Templeman came to see the band play. He introduced the boys to Mo and Ted, and shortly thereafter became their personal manager at Mo's urging. Even at this first lunch, it wasn't clear to me exactly what Marshall's relationship was to the band, mostly because he wasn't there. I found it strange that he hadn't attended the initial meeting in Burbank. In my opinion, a personal manager should always be present when a band is meeting with record company executives, and should be heavily involved when they're planning a tour, especially when it comes to a brand new contract. I tried to ignore my initial reaction. Maybe he was out of town, or maybe he had already gone over the talking points with Carl. I had no idea, and at the time, I didn't really care. Later, as I got to know Marshall and saw his behavior up close and personal, the fact that he had missed the initial meeting made perfect sense to me, and was a sign of things to come. After lunch, we all went back to the offices and took the band on a quick meet and greet, introducing them to a few other key players. Then we went our separate ways. Within 48 hours, I was on the road with another band whose tour would last the next few weeks. I wouldn't see any members of Van Halen until nearly 2 months later, at the end of February, when I caught up with them in Chicago, ready to kick off the tour. Then, for better or for worse, Van Halen became my world. While I was away, the buzz surrounding Van Halen became louder and more substantive. They had dropped one of the best debut albums in the history of rock and roll, becoming a household name practically overnight. There wasn't a car radio in any part of the country that wasn't routinely blasting their cover of You Really Got Me, a fresh-faced, upbeat version of the classic Kinks song, and Van Halen was promising to live up to the hype Carl had predicted. The man had been right. Everyone loved David's energy and Edward's electric, out-of-the-box guitar work. They were a hit. All this came as a huge relief. Sure, Carl and I had both done well with the Sex Pistols, but after almost 4 months on the charts, and perhaps attributable to their very specific audience, never mind the Bullocks still hadn't reached gold status. Even so, the Pistols had become the center of much media attention, which cemented the album's place in history as a cult hit. So, we had counted it as a win, or at least I had, and I had the I Survived the Sex Pistols Tour t-shirt given to me by Ted Cohen to prove it. But with success comes pressure. Van Halen was crucial to advancing our careers and credibility, and the stakes were higher than ever. Naturally, they were much higher for Carl. He was a vice president after all, and it was his ass on the line much more so than mine, but I sympathized and had my own role to play. See, this is where I came in. It was my job to steer Van Halen through the rough, rigorous, and grueling process that separates the great bands from the wannabes and one-hit wonders. It was up to me to help Van Halen transition from a club mentality with limited resources and production to the big show. At the end of this tour, there would either be a band that would be right at home in front of several thousand fans, or their careers would be over. I knew how to guide them along this journey. With Carl's backing and with his emotional support and the financial muscle of Warner Brothers, I could make it happen. But not without a great record. Until then, I had been worried that I had been saddled with the impossible task of churning chicken into chicken salad. I had been down that road before, albeit with less at stake, and it all rests on the album. Artists' careers hinged on whether these 12-inch sheets of black vinyl had any substance to them or not. Without a good one, you were dead in the water. If the music sucked, people wouldn't buy the records. And if they didn't buy the records, they sure as weren't going to shell out even more of their hard-earned cash to see the band live. This was synergy at work. The single caught their attention, then the album grew the audience, and then the audience supported the tour. I knew the reality of the world in which I worked. No matter how much money you threw at a project, or how talented and hardworking your production and promotional staffs might have been, it all came down to the record. It's not something you could fake. Van Halen didn't need to. They were the complete package. There's an old saying in the music business. We want the girls in the audience to be with the boys in the band, and we want the guys in the audience to wish they were in the band. Van Halen nailed it. They nailed the girls in the audience too, but that's beside the point. Released on February 10, 1978, the album sold briskly from the onset, although it wasn't an overnight sensation. Rather, it peaked at a high of number 19 on the US charts roughly 1 month after it was released. Van Halen made good on the promise of the previously released EP, and this time has served only to burnish its reputation. Simply put, the album holds up. A few years back, Rolling Stone placed Van Halen at number 27 on its list of the 100 greatest debut albums in rock and roll history. The strutting front man, a spandex-clad love machine, the finger-flying guitar hero, the keg stand rhythm section, Van Halen was the ultimate party band, and their debut feels like the 80s arriving 2 years ahead of schedule. Tunes like the fist-pumping Runnin With The Devil, the muscular Atomic Punk, a thunderous cover of You Really Got Me, and Ain't Talking About Love put the showbiz swagger back in hard rock, and Eddie Van Halen's jaw-dropping technique raised the bar for six-string pyrotechnics, particularly on Eruption, the solo that launched 1,000 dudes messing around at Guitar Center. Yeah, that all sounds about right. Van Halen was a fantastic debut that instantly displayed everything fans came to know and love about the band. More than 24 songs were brought into the studio and considered for inclusion on the album, with the final list paired to a tight and muscular 11. 9 original compositions and 2 covers. The album was not an overnight sensation, but man, did this thing have legs. In part because of the band's stellar live shows and a youthful commitment to endless touring, Van Halen became one of those albums that simply would not go away, spending an incredible 169 weeks, more than 3 years on the charts. It reached gold status on May 24, 1978, and platinum status the following October. The album surpassed 10 million copies sold in 1996 and continues to be a staple of classic rock radio stations today. That, my friends, is what is known as legacy. Despite all this, as I prepared to join the band in Chicago for the first date on their tour, I still hadn't heard a single Van Halen song, a feat which in hindsight I can only contribute to dumb luck. Van Halen had announced themselves with a thunderous roar, and by the time I headed out to Chicago to meet up with them, they were sending shockwaves through the industry. They were more than ready for their first show as the opening act for Runnin Montrose and would-be rock legend Journey, kicking off what would prove to be, what would have always been, regardless of what came next, one hell of a memorable tour. When the band got off the plane in Chicago on February 28, 1978, they were dressed exactly as they had been the last time I saw them. By that I mean they were wearing the exact same clothes, which in retrospect is kind of sweet and refreshing. David was a rich kid, so he could afford a rich kid's wardrobe, but I had met him twice now, and both times he was dressed like any other Southern California kid who wanted to look like he was in a band, jeans and t-shirts and boots. The other guys had barely 2 nickels to rub together, and weren't about to waste what little they did have on clothes. At the risk of sounding sentimental, all 4 of them had stars in their eyes and smiles on their faces. In that moment, I found them enormously appealing. They were poised for stardom, but I don't think they realized it. If David did, it was only in the abstract. Their album had been out less than 3 weeks, and they had not yet played a live show in support of it. They had no idea what lay ahead. Then again, neither did I. The first day was given over to travel and acclimation, which was a welcome respite for me. 2 days of rehearsals at SIR studio and instrumental rentals would follow before the band played its first live show on March 3rd at the Aragon Ballroom, a 5,000-seat venue on West Lawrence Avenue, roughly 5 miles from downtown Chicago. I caught bits and pieces of the first rehearsal, but much of my day was devoted to logistical issues. The band was accompanied on this trip by roughly 7 or 8 hand-picked crew members, including a drum technician named Greg Emerson, who was Alex's buddy from high school, and Rudy Liren, a guitar tech whose primary qualification was that he was a very close friend of Edward's. I had brought along my old friend Gary Geller, aka Red Roadie, to fill the dual roles of stage manager and bass tech for Michael Anthony. This was the first time I had met the road crew, and they seemed like decent enough guys, every bit as starstruck and goofy as the band members themselves. I hoped that they would be good at their jobs, because I knew that given their friendships with Eddie and Alex, there was no way I could ever fire them. To their credit, Rudy and Greg took their work seriously. But hey, what good is nepotism if you can't take care of your friends? Until Van Halen joined them, Journey and Montrose had played Davenport, Iowa, and Racine, Washington, respectively. As you can imagine, the crowd at the Aragon Ballroom was twice the size easily. No offense, but Davenport and Racine were the minors, Chicago were the majors, and Van Halen hadn't just come to play, they had come to win. This was a great opportunity, and we were here to take full advantage of it. We were a supporting act, filling the 3rd spot on a triple bill, and we'd be getting our feet wet playing to venues that seated from 2,500 to as many as 8,000 screaming, drunken fans. On paper, it was the perfect way to kick off Van Halen's first major label tour. For a band just starting to gain traction, this was a pretty sweet spot to be in. We had been added to the bill because Journey, which after years of being unable to break through, had just hired a new vocalist, Steve Perry, revamped its sound, and released a game-changing album, Infinity. Still wasn't big enough to sell tickets on its own. Ronnie Montrose, formerly the frontman of Montrose, a band that had been fairly popular prior to the departure of lead singer Sammy Hagar 2 years earlier, were beginning to fade from public perception. Van Halen brought a lot of energy to the lineup, and as soon as we were announced, tickets started selling. We were new, fresh-faced, and exciting, but Journey was the best known of the 3 bands at that point, with the brightest resume, and so they were accorded headliner status. That was fine with us. It gave the boys the opportunity to play in front of bigger crowds than they had ever experienced, and to polish their live show without the burden of expectations that comes with headlining a tour. If they were good enough, they would blow the headliners off the stage anyway. A tour is very much a mediocrity. It can be challenging to play in front of an audience composed almost entirely of fans who have paid to see the headliner. Later we'd start calling the supporting bands T-shirt acts, because all they had to do was occupy the stage while the fans were outside purchasing merchandise. But sometimes if a band is good enough, it will win the crowd over. We were that band, there was no doubt about that, and we were more confident that it wouldn't be long before all eyes were on us. But nothing is ever that simple on the road. We arrived at the theater in the early afternoon and found a tiny dressing room waiting for us. The space was cramped and not well lit. But this was hardly unusual. How much room do you really need to change from street clothes into stage clothes? These guys have been changing in their cars or in high school locker rooms for years, when they bothered to change at all, that is. Part of the beauty and fun of taking a new band out on the road is that everyone tends to be very low maintenance. While naturally somewhat nervous and anxious, the guys in Van Halen were mostly thrilled just to be out of Southern California. Aside from David, they were not exactly world travelers, and now here they were in Chicago. They couldn't have been more excited nor cared less about their dressing room accommodations. Unfortunately, the dressing room was not the only place that was a bit too small for comfort. You see, the problem with booking 3 bands into one venue on a given night is that there isn't always enough space for each band's equipment. As the headliner, Journey took precedence. Montrose came next. There isn't time to completely break down the stage and equipment after each act performs, so all 3 road crews work together during the day. The headliner's equipment, amps, instruments, etc., goes farthest in the back. The middle act places its equipment in the middle, and the opening act takes whatever space is left at the front of the stage. Then as each band completes its set, a layer of equipment is peeled away or pushed to the side during a quick changeover. By the time we began setting up our equipment, after Journey had assembled its backline of amps and drum kit, and Montrose had done the same in front of Journey, there was almost no space left. It had taken so long for the other 2 bands to load and set up their equipment that our crew was forced to load through the front aisle of the theater. On stage, we were left with a space only 12 to 14 feet wide, in which David, Edward, and Michael could strut their stuff. For David, and to a lesser extent Edward, this was a serious impediment. David was accustomed to running around the stage and even into the audience. He used every inch of the performance space. While the guys were still in the dressing room, I went out into the arena to see how things were going. The stage was impossibly crowded. There was equipment everywhere. Tangled, knotted electrical cords formed nests on the hardwood and provided another potential obstacle. My first stop was to the mixing board, where Tom Broderick, our sound man, was hard at work. "How's it going?" I asked him. He responded with a thumbs up and a confident smile. Then I checked on Peter Anglis, our young and somewhat inexperienced but talented lighting man. Peter would go on to become a successful cinematographer and music video director, as well as talent manager, but at this time he was relatively new to the business. Before I even had a chance to say a word, I could tell something was wrong. Pete's face was ashen, his expression grim. I jumped up onto the light platform next to him. "Hey, Pete, is there a problem?" He nodded. "My headset isn't working right. I have no communication with the spotlight operators." He paused. Strictly speaking, he was right. Pete would normally spend the entire night on his headset telling each of his spot operators when and where to direct their equipment. It was a complicated dance and required not just complete focus on the part of everyone involved, but also a blueprint to guide the proceedings. Pete had seen multiple Van Halen performances and knew the band's stage show intimately. But without properly functioning headsets, he was basically helpless, like an air traffic controller without radar. But the show must go on, right? As a former sound man and stage manager, I had seen firsthand just about everything that could possibly go wrong in a live show. There was always a way around it. "Let's not panic, Peter," I said. "I have an idea." "What's that?" "I'll call the spots as you do the stage lighting." Peter looked at me as if I were crazy. "No offense, Noel, but you've never even seen the show." I laughed. That was an irrefutable point. It also didn't matter. Drastic times call for drastic measures. "Guess I'll just have to wing it," I said. I jumped off the platform and headed to the ladder that ascended to the 4 spotlight operators. They were all holding their useless headsets in their hands. "Okay," I said, "I'm going to direct spots from up here." They looked at me quizzically, then looked at each other, then they shrugged. I didn't take this as a sign of complacency or disrespect. These guys were unflappable, which is exactly what we needed in a time of crisis. It also turned out that they were a knowledgeable bunch of spot operators, which made my Band-Aid approach to the evening much more successful than it might have otherwise been. I looked at my watch and realized that Van Halen was scheduled to take the stage in less than half an hour, so I scrambled down the ladder and made my way to the dressing room. The place was a mess, tight and cramped and musty, and the boys were clearly agitated and nervous. This was to be expected, given the anxiety was surely heightened by the overall feeling of claustrophobia and chaos that accompanied the show, and now I was obligated to add to the tension. Listen guys, there's a problem with Peter's lighting headset. I'm going to call the spots on the fly. At first, no one said anything. I think they were distracted. I didn't mean to make them more nervous, but they had to know the situation as we'd all be doing a bit of ad-libbing. Finally, David spoke up.
How the... are you gonna call spots? He said, his voice already raspy from warming up.
This was not a bad thing. Dave was at his best when his voice became a low
growl. You don't even know the show.
As was the case with Peter, David was stating the obvious, and there was no reasonable counter-argument. I hadn't seen the show, but I had seen and worked thousands of other shows, so I figured we could get through this. Don't worry, I said. It'll be fine. Dave laughed sarcastically.
It better be, man.
Look, I said to Dave, I'm going to put you in the wings, stage left. When Marshall says Van Halen, you just take control and do the best show you can. Let me worry about calling spots. Marshall Burla had gone into town that day and would be introducing the band to the audience. What I did not tell the band was that Carl Scott and more than a dozen Warner Brothers executives from promotion and artistic development were also in attendance. They didn't need any more pressure. I ran out to the spotlighter and got into position. Get ready to hit all four guys when they come out, I said to the spotlight operators. Just follow your man. How can I best describe that first show? Certainly won't be remembered as one of the finest nights in the annals of Van Halen history. Technical issues, a congested stage, and a spectacularly bad footwear decision on the part of the boys made it a challenging night. During rehearsals, I had noticed that all four band members had decided for some reason to wear platform boots with thick 3-inch heels. I had suggested more sensible shoes for opening night, but had been rebuffed, most notably by Alex. These are our Kiss boots, he said, smiling proudly. We paid $300 for these. We love them. This seemed to me like a staggeringly poor use of funds, especially for the 3/4 of the band that did not come from family money. But I didn't argue about it. There were too many issues taking up my time, and it wasn't my place to dictate the band's wardrobe. In retrospect, maybe I should have pressed the matter. From the opening notes of the opening song, On Fire, it was apparent that the platform shoes were a bad idea. Maybe they worked for Kiss, especially with anchoring outrageous black costumes and makeup and traversing a vast performance space, as was usually the case with Kiss in those days. But here at the Aragon Ballroom, on a stage shrunk to half of its normal size because of an overabundance of equipment, with electrical cords and audio cables lurking underfoot, Kiss boots were an imprudent choice. Still, the band soldiered on, as did those of us providing technical support, and together we got through it. Van Halen cranked out 10 tunes, a bass solo and a drum solo, and an energetic set that lasted roughly 35 minutes. The sold-out crowd of 5,450 seemed astonished by Edwards' virtuoso guitar work. If the boys were somewhat less animated than usual, well, that's only because they wanted to avoid tripping or falling off the stage. Sometimes discretion really is the better part of valor. As soon as the show ended, I thanked the lighting guys and then shared a celebratory handshake with Peter. Then I went to the dressing room where I found Alex, Eddie, Michael, and David already deconstructing the show. They weren't angry, but neither were they pleased. I took this as a good sign, that this was a band with some serious ambition. They knew they were capable of doing better, and the improvement would start with a change in wardrobes. Guys, you have to lose the high heels, I said. At first there was no response. A few moments later, though, Peter came into the dressing room. David, he said calmly, for God's sake, try wearing capizos or something. David twisted his face into a look of disgust. Man, I'll be 3 inches shorter. David was not a little guy. He stood about 6'1" and had a lean but muscular build with a thick carpet of frequently exposed chest hair. By any reasonable definition, he cut an impressive figure on stage, but it wasn't enough for Dave. He wanted to tower over everyone else, his bandmates, the audience, everyone. For now, though, David was a reasonable and ambitious artist willing to check his oversized ego in the pursuit of a better performance. David, you looked awkward out there, I said. You don't want that. It detracts from the show. You guys are an athletic band. People need to see that. Begrudgingly, David agreed, and the others followed suit. That night at the Aragon Ballroom was a turning point for Van Halen and Heels. David did indeed switch to Capizzos, while the other guys donned sneakers. Van Halen was never a glam rock band. They were a guitar rock band, and one of the most dynamic live acts of the late 1970s and early 1980s. From that moment on, they dressed the part. As we were leaving the venue, I spotted the road crew who were still standing around the truck. "How come you guys haven't left yet?" I asked. A couple of them laughed in that road-weary way I had heard among crews many times before. It's a knowing laugh that comes with having seen almost everything, and understanding that when it comes to the road life, Murphy's Law is no joke. Anything that can go wrong, will go wrong. The first person to speak up was Red. According to him, one of the guys had left the light on and the battery was dead. Red assured me not to worry. Ryder was on its way to fix the battery and they'd catch up with us at the hotel. By the time we got back to the Holiday Inn City Center, we were all in need of a bit of lubrication, following a long and exhausting day. I went straight to the bar with Pete and Tommy. The guys in the band were already there. "You guys like Jack Daniels?" Michael Anthony asked. "Sure," I said. "Who doesn't?" "Well, all right then," Michael said, smiling. "I got first round." By the time we got to the second round, the rest of the crew had arrived. Apparently Ryder had come to the rescue, and seasoned pros that they were, the crew had loaded up the truck quickly and gotten back in time to celebrate the end of a hard day of work. As the evening wore on, I had time to chat individually with each member of the band and found them all congenial. They wanted to be a great band and were willing to work hard and take advice in order to make that happen. Despite all the problems we had faced on opening night and the fact that it was demonstrably not a great show, I could not have been more optimistic. Van Halen had a terrific debut album, and with a few minor adjustments and a lucky break or two, they would be an equally terrific live act. I look back on this night now as an almost impossibly innocent and happy time. Imagine walking into a hotel bar even 1 year later and seeing the guys from Van Halen throwing back shots of Jack Daniels, rubbing elbows with assorted businessmen and tourists, none of whom had any idea who these kids were. The anonymity would not last, of course, and neither would the innocence. But then, it never does. By midnight we were all tired, and the bar was getting ready to shut down. We finished our drinks and headed to a bank of elevators. By rock and roll standards, or any standards for that matter, it certainly had not been a long night of partying, but it had been a long night. As the elevator began to climb, Edward nudged David in the ribs. "Hey man, you got any Krell?" Dave nodded. Yeah, I'll meet you in your room." The elevator stopped on the 8th floor. They politely said goodnight and exited. Pete and I were on the 11th floor. As the elevator rose, I had to admit my ignorance and curiosity. I had been around a bit in my 31 years. I had traveled all over the world and ingested my share of illicit substances, although rarely to excess, but I had never heard of Krell. "What the are they talking about?" I asked Pete. He chuckled. "Krell is our slang for cocaine," he said. Then, perhaps in an attempt to intercept the next question, he added, "Want to know what we call weed?" "Sure, why not?" "Snade," he said. "Snade," I repeated. It sounded like a ridiculous word. It also sounded a lot like weed, so I wondered why bother changing it. "Interesting," I said. "Where did that come from?" Pete looked at me. His eyes were glassy from whiskey and too many hours without sleep. A perplexed look came across his face, as if this were the first time he had ever been asked this particular question. "You know what?" he said. "I have no clue." We both laughed as the elevator lurched its way to the 11th floor. That night I slept only a few hours before being awoken by a phone call from Carl Scott. To this day, Carl will deny making this phone call, but I was on the receiving end, and I know it wasn't a dream. In his voice there was concern, if not outright panic. He had seen the show at the Aragon and was not happy. "Noel, what are we going to do?" I tried to shake the cobwebs from my head. "What are you talking about?" "The show," he said. "It was terrible. We had a lot invested in this act, and that's the way they start out?" I took a deep breath. On one hand, Carl had a point. It was not a stellar debut for Van Halen, but yeah, Warner Brothers, Carl in particular, had a great deal riding on the band's success. On the other hand, Carl did not understand what a colossal cluster the day had been. Circumstances widely beyond the band's control, beyond anybody's control, had conspired to make it a challenging debut. Under the circumstances, I thought, it had been a respectable performance. You couldn't have come away from that show without being impressed by Edward's guitar work and Moon Boots' withstanding. It was apparent also that David was a potentially great frontman. They were limited by time and space, and we were all hampered by technical difficulties. Truthfully, we were lucky it went as well as it did, but I didn't say any of this. I was too tired. Instead, I just tried to calm him down and get off the phone as quickly as possible. "Don't worry, Carl. Give us a couple weeks and we'll be ready for prime time." "Okay," he said. "I hope so." Well, that's the end of Chapter 2. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 2 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.